All right, so today looks like we're diving into some pretty serious history. The Cold War, huh? So you really want to get a grip on this era.
Definitely an era that shaped the world, even now, decades later.
Absolutely. It's way more than just some dates and names in a textbook, right? We're talking espionage, close calls, the whole nine yards.
Definitely. We're going to uncover some real human stories, the strategies behind the scenes, some moments that could have changed everything. I mean, the Cold War, it was a war fought in the shadows, a clash of ideologies on this massive global chessboard.
So before we get into all that, let's set the stage here.
Yeah.
The Cold War, what are we really talking about when we say that?
Well, it lasted roughly from 1947 to 1991. Geopolitical tension, mainly between the United States and the Soviet Union, and their allies, of course.
Got it.
Instead of huge battles between, like, the superpowers themselves, you had all these proxy wars, tons of espionage, propaganda flying around, and that arms race that just kept everyone on edge.
It's kind of crazy to think about, right? The U.S. and the Soviet Union, they were allies in World War II. How'd they go from fighting together to, like, rivals so fast?
World War II ended, and there was this power vacuum, yeah. The U.S. and the Soviets had completely different ideas about the future.
Totally.
The U.S., all about capitalism and democracy, they saw the Soviet Union, their communist ideology, their expansion as like a direct threat. And the Soviets, they saw the U.S. as this imperialistic power trying to take over everything.
So, like, clashing ideologies, a power grab. Not exactly a recipe for peace and harmony, huh?
No, not at all. That tension, it really played out in a bunch of flashpoints, confrontations that totally define the era.
And one of the first big ones, the Berlin Blockade, right?
Right.
Back in 1948. Sounds like something out of a spy movie.
It really does. The Soviets tried to isolate West Berlin, force the Western allies out, so they blocked off all land access to the city. But get this, the West's response, they airlifted over 2 million tons of supplies. Food, fuel, medicine, everything. Kept the people of West Berlin going for almost a year.
Wow, that must have been just incredible. Logistically, I mean, especially back then. It makes you think about those people on the ground living their lives with planes constantly overhead, knowing that, that was it. That was their lifeline.
For sure. The Berlin airlift wasn't just like a logistical win. It was totally symbolic for the West, their commitment to containing Soviet expansion and, showed what nonviolent resistance could do.
And from Europe, that Cold War tension just spread everywhere. The Korean War, just a few years later. That's a pretty stark example of how those ideological battles had real-world consequences.
Absolutely. The Korean War, 1950 to 53, a tragic proxy war, with the U.S. backing South Korea and the Soviet Union and China backing North Korea. Brutal conflict, millions of casualties, and then a divided Korea, a legacy that's, still with us today.
It really shows how the Cold War redrew the world map. Not just about the superpowers, but smaller nations getting pulled into this global struggle.
And that leads us to another key Cold War concept, proxy wars. These were wars where the superpowers themselves weren't directly fighting each other, but they were backing different sides in regional conflicts, trying to push their own agenda, and of course, contain the other side's influence.
Like a high-stakes chess game, right? Every move on this global board, and for anyone caught in the middle, the consequences were devastating.
Exactly. And the Vietnam War, another proxy war. The U.S. got involved originally to stop communism from spreading in Southeast Asia, but it became this quagmire that split American society and left a huge mark on the region.
It's wild how these ideological battles had such a huge impact on the world. And then, of course, there's the event that might define the Cold War more than anything else, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
This wasn't a proxy war anymore. This was a direct showdown.
Oh, yeah. 1962, and the world held its breath for 13 days. U.S. and the Soviet Union right on the edge of nuclear war. The Soviets had put nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The U.S. responded with a naval blockade.
Those 13 days, I can't even imagine everyone watching, waiting, wondering if this was it,
It was the closest we've ever come to full-blown nuclear war. Luckily, diplomacy won out. But the Cuban Missile Crisis, it showed just how fragile peace is and the terrifying consequences if someone miscalculates.
Chilling, for sure. And the Cuban Missile Crisis, it really underscored the whole terrifying reality of the nuclear arms race, right?
Absolutely. The arms race was a huge part of the Cold War. This constant competition between the superpowers trying to develop and stockpile more and more powerful nuclear weapons.
But it wasn't just about, having the biggest bombs, right? There was a whole strategic philosophy behind it.
Oh, definitely. And that's where mutually assured destruction comes in, or MAD. That became the terrifying logic of the whole nuclear age. The idea was that if one side launched a nuclear attack, the other side would hit back. And the result? Total annihilation of both. It was a paradox. The threat of total destruction was supposed to stop either side from actually using those weapons.
So this balance of terror, that's what kept the world from ending in a nuclear holocaust.
Yeah, in a way. But it was a balance built on fear and the hope that everyone was being rational. And the Cuban Missile Crisis, that showed how easily that balance could be broken.
Right.
But the arms race, that was just one piece of the Cold War rivalry.
It seems like the U.S. and the Soviets were competing on every level: military, technology, economics, even culture.
Exactly. And that's where the space race comes in, another huge chapter in the Cold War story.
The space race. Like something out of science fiction happening in real time. It all started with Sputnik in 1957, right? The Soviets launched the first artificial satellite. Do you remember when you heard about that?
It was a real wake-up call for the U.S. The Soviets, it could achieve these technological feats that no one thought possible. And it kicked the U.S. into high gear. They had to catch up.
And they did. The U.S., they had this incredible victory in 1969 with Apollo 11, first humans on the moon. Neil Armstrong taking that one small step must have felt like a giant leap for the U.S. in this whole global rivalry.
Apollo 11 was huge, not just for the U.S., for all of humanity, It showed what human ingenuity could do, the possibilities of space exploration.
But the space race, it wasn't just about science, was it? It was this symbolic battle for, well, supremacy between the two superpowers.
Oh, absolutely. The space race was about national pride, proving their tech was better, even ideological superiority. Every launch, every milestone, it was all a victory in the bigger Cold War fight.
So you have this rivalry playing out across the world: proxy wars, nuclear brinksmanship, a race to space. But the Cold War, it wasn't just a U.S.-Soviet thing, was it? It had this global impact, changed alliances, influenced conflicts all over the place.
Yeah, that's right. The Cold War was a global thing, touched every corner of the world.
And a big part of that global dimension, that was the formation of these alliances, right? The U.S. and their allies in Western Europe formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and then the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact with their Eastern European satellite states.
Those alliances, they locked in the division of the world. Two opposing camps, each with their own armies, nuclear weapons, and their own ideology.
It's like the world got split into these two giant teams, always on guard, preparing for a war they hoped would never actually happen.
And remember those proxy wars we talked about? The Cold War fueled a ton of those around the world. The superpowers, they'd back opposing sides in conflicts in Asia, Africa, Latin America, often with terrible consequences for the countries involved.
Yeah, we talked about Korea and Vietnam, but there were a lot more. Afghanistan, Angola, Nicaragua. Just a few examples of how the Cold War took local conflicts and turned them into global flashpoints.
The superpowers, they used those proxy wars to further their own goals, try to contain each other, and a lot of times it was the people living in those countries who paid the price.
It's a reminder that the Cold War wasn't just about ideas, it was about real people and real consequences. And it wasn't just about military intervention either. The superpowers, they were also competing for influence in the developing world, using economic aid, political pressure, even cultural diplomacy.
They were fighting for hearts and minds all over the planet, trying to win people over to their ideology, to their way of life.
So the Cold War, it was this complex, multi-layered struggle, battles on every front: military, political, economic, cultural.
Exactly. And to really understand the Cold War's lasting impact, to see how it still shapes the world today,
Right.
you have to grasp that complexity.
But before we get into that legacy, I think we need to focus on the people who lived through the Cold War. Hear their stories, understand how they experienced this era of tension and uncertainty firsthand.
I agree. The Cold War wasn't just about abstract ideologies and big-picture strategies. It was about real people living their lives under this shadow of conflict, the threat of nuclear annihilation hanging over everything.
Let's hear those stories, those personal experiences, and see how they bring the Cold War to life.
It's easy to get lost in, the big picture stuff, the global chessboard and all that. But for millions of people, this was their life.
Yeah, it's easy to forget about the people behind the headlines, right? The ones whose lives were actually changed by all this.
Totally. Imagine, being a family in East Berlin, separated from loved ones by a wall, barbed wire, knowing that any day things could blow up.
It's hard to fathom living with that kind of uncertainty every day.
And for those living under, communist rule in the Soviet bloc, it wasn't just fear. They didn't have basic freedoms. The state controlled everything: the media, education, even what jobs people could have. If you spoke out against the government, you were in trouble.
Wow. That level of control is just mind-boggling. Was there any pushback? Anyone who tried to resist?
Oh, there were definitely pockets of resistance, like the Hungarian uprising back in '56 or the Prague Spring in '68. People stood up, demanded freedom and democracy, and got crushed by Soviet tanks. It really showed you the limits of dissent in the Soviet sphere.
Those events must have been so shocking to the West. It really highlights what was at stake in the Cold War and how brave those people were to stand up to the Soviet system.
And on the other side of the Iron Curtain, in the West, there was this fear of communist infiltration, the whole Red Scare thing,
Yeah.
that had its own chilling effect.
Fear is a powerful weapon, isn't it? No matter who's using it.
Yeah, and in the Cold War, both sides used it pretty effectively. In the U.S., the Red Scare led to the McCarthy era, this period of intense anti-communist paranoia, people blacklisted, careers ruined, basic freedoms eroded.
McCarthy's campaign to root out communists in the government, that was a pretty dark time in American history. It shows how easily fear and ideology can lead to, really bad things, even in a democracy.
Absolutely. And the Cold War wasn't just about the U.S. and the Soviet Union. It had a huge impact all over the world, especially those developing nations that called it the Third World back then.
We talked about proxy wars before, but were there other ways that the Cold War affected these countries?
A lot of developing nations got pulled into the Cold War, often forced to pick a side. They were promised economic aid, military help, all sorts of things. But in the end, it was the superpowers' interests that mattered.
So they were stuck in the middle of this global tug of war.
Yeah, pretty much. And the consequences for a lot of these countries were really bad. They got dragged into wars, their economies got messed up, their political systems manipulated to help one superpower or the other.
It's easy to forget that the Cold War wasn't just a war of ideas. It was a war with real consequences for people, especially in those battleground countries.
For sure. But we should also remember that even with all the tension and rivalry, there were still moments of cultural exchange and cooperation during the Cold War.
That's interesting. So it wasn't just about building walls, but also like trying to build bridges.
Exactly. There were these cultural exchanges, sporting events, scientific collaborations, all happening despite the political divisions. They were often mixed with propaganda and strategy, of course, but they showed that there was still some shared humanity, some potential for cooperation.
It makes you wonder what could have been possible if the Cold War hadn't been such a big thing looming over everything.
Yeah, it does. But even with those limitations, there were moments when the human spirit kind of broke through the ideological divide.
Like, what? Can you give us an example of that cultural exchange thing?
Sure. Think about the impact of American jazz music on the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe.
Jazz.
Yeah. Jazz, it was all about improvisation, individual expression. It represented freedom, creativity, the kind of stuff the Soviet system tried to suppress.
So jazz music was like a threat to the Soviet order.
Exactly. They tried to control it, censor it, but it still got through, It found an audience, especially among young people. They were hungry for something different, something more.
It's amazing how art and culture can be so powerful, even in places where things are really restricted.
It shows you how much people need to express themselves, to connect with each other, to find something that goes beyond politics and ideology. And during the Cold War, even while the superpowers were fighting, things like music, art, and literature, they helped bridge that divide, even if it was just for a little while.
It reminds you that even in dark times, there's always hope, right? That shared humanity, the possibility of something better.
And maybe, just maybe, those little bits of hope helped pave the way for the end of the Cold War.
We've talked about how the Cold War started, the major events, the global impact. We've explored the fear, the tension, that threat of nuclear war, and how all of this affected people all over the world.
We've also seen how, even with all that conflict and division, there were moments of cultural exchange, of people connecting with each other. Reminders that we're all human, no matter what side of the Iron Curtain we're on.
But the big question is, how did it all end? How did the Cold War, something that seemed like it would go on forever, finally come to an end?
It's a complex story, a lot of factors at play, but one key figure was Mikhail Gorbachev. He became the leader of the Soviet Union in 1985.
Gorbachev, he was a reformer, right? He wanted to change things up in the Soviet Union.
He did. Gorbachev, he knew that the Soviet system was in trouble. The economy was weak, the political system was stagnant, so he introduced these policies, glasnost and perestroika. They were meant to open up Soviet society and restructure the economy.
Those were pretty big changes for a system that had been so closed off for so long. What was he thinking? What was his goal?
His goals were complicated, maybe even contradictory. He wanted to save the Soviet system, make it work better, you know? But his reforms, especially Glasnost, that meant openness, and it unleashed these forces that he couldn't control.
So his reforms, the things he did to try to save the Soviet Union, they might have actually helped bring it down.
It's kind of a paradox, yeah. By loosening the control of the Communist Party and giving people more freedom of speech, he accidentally set in motion the events that led to the collapse of the Soviet Empire.
Wow. And one of the most dramatic events was the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Everyone remembers seeing that on TV. It was the end of an era.
The fall of the Berlin Wall was a huge turning point. It showed that the Soviet system was crumbling, and it marked the end of the Cold War. It was this incredible moment of joy and liberation, but it also meant a new era of uncertainty and change.
It's fascinating how Gorbachev's reforms, the things he did to try and fix the Soviet Union, they actually led to its collapse. And the Berlin Wall, this symbol of oppression, it became a symbol of freedom.
It shows you that history is full of unintended consequences, you know? Even the most powerful empires can crumble, and people will always fight for freedom.
So the Berlin Wall falls, the Soviet bloc starts to fall apart. But were there other things going on, like economic problems that contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Yeah, definitely. The Soviet economy had been struggling for years. It was centrally planned, super inefficient. It couldn't keep up with the West.
So it was a mix of political, social, and economic factors that ended the Cold War.
Right. It was like this perfect storm of pressure, both internal and external, that finally caused the Soviet Union to collapse in 1991. That was the official end of the Cold War.
It's crazy how fast it happened. You know, the Cold War, it felt like it'd just go on forever.
Yeah.
And then boom, it's over.
It was a huge turning point, and it
Yeah.
left the world with a whole new set of challenges and opportunities.
We've talked about the beginning, the big events, the global impact, and how it all ended. But what about the human side of it all? What about the people who lived through this time?
I think it's time we hear some of their stories. Let's hear from the people who saw the Cold War firsthand and understand how complex and contradictory it really was.
It's kind of wild to think about everything we've covered, right?
Yep.
The clash of ideologies, those terrifying weapons, the whole global power struggle. But we can't lose sight of the people at the heart of it all, how it actually affected their lives.
Exactly. The Cold War, it wasn't just an event in a history book. For millions, it was their reality, you know? Imagine living in a divided city like, say, Berlin. You're cut off from family and friends by a literal wall, and every day there's this feeling that things could just explode.
I can't even begin to imagine that.
Yeah.
Living with that kind of tension, never knowing what's coming next. What was daily life even like for those folks?
Especially in the Soviet bloc, life was tightly controlled. The state had its hands in everything, the news, jobs, the whole deal. Think about the artists and writers, you know? Their creativity stifled, everything they did watched closely.
So it wasn't just a geopolitical thing. It was this battle for what people believed in, their values. Was there anyone who pushed back against all that?
Oh, absolutely. People like Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, he used his writing to challenge the regime, called out their hypocrisy, fought for freedom. It took a lot of courage because, you know, doing that could get you thrown in jail or exiled.
It's incredible, people standing up for what they believe
Right.
in, even with all that danger. Those stories really drive home the human cost of this ideological war.
Yeah, and on the other side of the Iron Curtain, you know, in the West, that fear of communists infiltrating everything, the whole Red Scare, that created its own brand of oppression. The McCarthy era in the U.S. with those witch hunts and blacklists, it showed how fear and paranoia can damage even a democracy.
Yeah, it makes you realize how fragile freedom really is, how easily things can go wrong.
And the effects of the Cold War, they went way beyond the U.S. and the Soviet Union, right? Remember all those developing nations?
Yeah.
They got caught in the middle of it all, forced to choose sides in this global power struggle.
Feels like the Cold War was this giant web, and everyone was caught in it somehow.
Right. And within that web, you also had moments of connection and cultural exchange, things that went beyond the politics. Take the ping-pong diplomacy back in '71, for example.
Ping-pong diplomacy.
Yeah. American table tennis players visited China. Kind of a crazy way to start a whole new chapter in U.S.-China relations, right?
Really highlights that even with all that rivalry, you could still have moments of cooperation and understanding.
And those exchanges, they often challenged the stories that each side was telling about the other. Like when American jazz musicians toured the Soviet Union, they brought this message of freedom and individuality. Really resonated with people behind the Iron Curtain.
Art and music, they kind of bypassed all the political talk and spoke directly to people.
Exactly. Those exchanges might have been small, but they planted seeds of doubt, this longing for something different.
So we've seen the fear, the tension, all the damage the Cold War caused. But there were also moments of bravery, resilience, even hope.
And ultimately, the Cold War didn't end with some big bang. The Soviet Union, they were struggling internally. Their economy was a mess. They just couldn't hold on anymore.
Their collapse really did mark the end of an era. But it left behind this whole new set of problems for the world to figure out.
Yeah, the post-Cold War world is still dealing with the fallout, right?
Yeah.
NATO expansion, new global powers emerging, everyone trying to figure out what comes next.
This deep dive has been a real journey. The Cold War was such a complex and, honestly, contradictory time.
And it's still relevant even today. It reminds us how dangerous ideological extremism can be, how fragile peace is, and how strongly people crave freedom.
As we think back on the Cold War, what can we learn from it? How can it help us deal with the world today?
I think the biggest takeaway is the need for dialogue, diplomacy, and trying to see things from other perspectives. The Cold War taught us that unchecked rivalry can be devastating, and that we need to find common ground even when we disagree.
And that's a lesson we should all keep in mind, especially now, right? The world is more interconnected than ever, and we need to work together to tackle these huge global problems.
The Cold War might be over, but its impact is still felt today. By understanding what happened, the good and the bad, we can better understand the forces shaping our world both now and in the future.
This deep dive has been a great way to explore the Cold War and its lasting legacy. Thanks for joining us.